The wind out on the Wyoming plains didn't just blow, it hunted. It scraped across the frozen earth like invisible claws, kicking up dust into the gray sky and rattling the hard ground beneath Mara's worn-out boots. She kept her head down, chin tucked into her chest, fighting every gust as if it were a living thing trying to shove her back toward the life she had just escaped. She had lost track of how long she'd been walking. It might have been 3 days, maybe 4. By now, time had just blurred into a haze of sharp pain and biting cold. Her boots were ruined, the leather worn as thin as paper, so every step felt like driving a nail through her heel. A blister had burst the day before, and she could feel the sticky, dark stain of dried blood inside a sock she couldn't afford to change. Clutched tight in her arms was a small bundle, just a few scraps of clothing wrapped in a faded shawl. It smelled faintly of lye soap and wood smoke. It was everything she owned in the world. Around her, the plains stretched out empty and endless in every direction. To the west, the mountains rose up like jagged teeth against a purple sky that looked heavy with snow. The sun was nothing more than a dim smudge behind the clouds, offering no warmth at all. Mara stumbled, her knee slamming hard into the frozen dirt. A cry tried to claw its way up her throat, but she swallowed it down. Tears would only waste water, and she didn't have a drop to spare. If you stop, the cold takes you, she whispered in her mind. It was the only thought keeping her legs moving. Silver Creek, the town she had left behind, already felt like a bad dream. She tried to push away the memories of the shallow lights, the muddy streets, and the whispers that clung to her skin like smoke. She remembered the boarding house where she'd stayed. It had changed hands, and the new owner, a stern-faced woman, had looked Mara up and down before closing the door in her face. "You are not respectable," the woman had sneered. Respectable. That word had never belonged to Mara, not since she was 16. She had begged the woman, offering to do chores, to scrub the floors until her hands bled, to stay invisible. But the door had shut anyway. And so, Mara had walked away, because standing still meant dying in the cold. Now, as the daylight began to fade into a bruised, dark evening, she saw it. A thin, gray line of smoke rising against the darkening sky. Hope stabbed through her fear, sharp and sudden. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant a roof. It meant shelter, a chance to just breathe for one single night. She forced her body to move faster, stumbling toward the shape emerging from the gloom. It was a cabin, sitting on a lonely rise of land, built from thick, weathered logs. A small corral stood beside it, where 2 horses braced themselves against the wind. The place looked rugged, isolated, and hard, just like the land around it. Mara climbed the single stone step and lifted her hand. For a moment, she froze. She knew exactly how she looked: ragged, desperate, alone. She knew what men thought when they saw a woman like her walking the plains without a horse or escort. But the cold was slicing through her bones now, leaving her no choice. She knocked. The wind swallowed the sound instantly. She knocked again, harder this time, pouring the last of her strength into the movement. Inside, a latch clicked. The door opened inward, slow and cautious. A tall man stood in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the warm glow of firelight behind him. He wore a heavy coat and a battered hat pulled low, and in one hand, resting easy but ready, was a Winchester rifle. He didn't speak. He just looked at her. Asterisk. His face told a story of its own, a map of hard years and long, brutal winters. A jagged scar cut down from his temple, disappearing into his beard, and his eyes were dark and guarded, revealing absolutely nothing. Mara tried to speak, but her throat felt like it was scraped raw. She swayed on her feet, dizzy from the sudden warmth drifting out of the cabin. "Help me," she whispered. The man didn't answer immediately. His gaze flicked past her, scanning the empty plains for danger, checking to see if she was bait for an ambush. Seeing nothing but swirling dust and the dying light, he looked back at her. His eyes dropped to her worn-out shoes, her trembling hands, and the blue tint of her lips. A flicker of something crossed his face, maybe annoyance, maybe pity. He lowered the rifle by an inch. "Come in before you let all the heat out," he said, his voice rough as gravel. She stumbled through the doorway. Her legs finally buckled, but he caught her elbow, steadying her just long enough for her to sink onto a bench at the wooden table. The cabin smelled of coffee and wood smoke. A cast-iron stove in the corner, radiance pulsating from it in. Waves, saddles hung from pegs, and a narrow bed sat against the far wall. It was a simple room, but to Mara, it was a palace. It was so warm that her eyes stung. "Drink slow," the man said, setting a tin cup of water in front of her. She didn't listen. She drank too fast, coughing as the cold water shocked her throat. Then drank again. He watched her, not unkindly, but with the weariness of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. He ladled thick stew into a bowl and slid it toward her. "Eat." She obeyed. Each mouthful felt like fire, spreading through her chest, thawing her from the inside out. Only after she scraped the bowl clean did he speak again. "Where'd you walk from?" "Silver Creek," she said softly. "That's 3 days in this weather." She nodded. "You walk alone?" "Yes." "Why?" She looked down at her hands. Her wrists were bruised yellow, faint reminders of what she'd endured. She chose a half-truth. "They put me out. No money left." He didn't. Believe her. She could smell his skepticism on the air, but he didn't push. He shifted his weight, wincing slightly as he leaned on a stiff left leg, an old injury. "I'm Eli Turner," he said. "Mara," she whispered. He studied her for another long moment before speaking the words she dreaded. "You can sleep here tonight. In the morning, I'll give you food and point you toward the stage road." Her stomach twisted into a knot. The stage road was 2 days away, 2 days she did not have. Not with winter coming down hard and her boots falling apart. If she left at dawn, she wouldn't last a mile. She thought of the wind outside, its teeth, its hunger. Then she looked at Eli's bed, the heat of the stove, the safety she had tasted for just a moment. Fear rose in her chest, bitter and desperate. She could not go back into that cold. He turned away, already making plans to send her off. Mara realized she had one chance, one thing she could offer. But this time, she did not offer it with shame. She offered it because she thought it was the only way to stay alive. Her voice trembled. "Eli, I ain't worth much." She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "But I just need a roof tonight." He froze. Slowly, he turned around. The fire cracked once, loud in the silence. His jaw clenched tight, not with desire and not with hunger. It was anger, a deep, aching anger that had nothing to do with her. "You listen to me," Eli said, his voice low and fierce. "You don't buy a roof with your body. Not here. Not with me." Mara stared at him, stunned into silence. He pointed to the bed. "You sleep there. I'll take the floor. That's the end of it." Her eyes burned. She had expected many things. Cruelty, contempt, indifference. She had not expected mercy. And for the first time in years, Mara felt something break open inside her, something small, something fragile, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. Dawn didn't break. It slid through the frosted window pane like a thin, pale blade of light. Mara jerked awake, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a split second, she didn't know where she was. The heavy quilt tucked around her chin, the scent of pine pitch and strong coffee. It all felt too safe to be real. Then the memory rushed back. The cabin, the storm. Eli Turner standing like a wall between her and the brutal cold. His voice echoed in her mind, rough but absolute. You. Don't buy a roof with your body. Not here. Not with me. She sat up slowly. Her muscles screamed with the deep, bruising soreness of exhaustion. But the bed god? The bed was warmer than anything she had slept in for years. Across the room, the cabin was empty. Through the logs, she heard the rhythmic clang-crack of fog, metal striking frozen water. Eli was already out there. She scrambled out of the warm blankets, shivering as the cool air hit her skin. She found the clothes he'd left for her, an oversized flannel shirt and canvas trousers that swallowed her small frame. She cinched them tight and stepped out the door. The wind hit her like a slap to the face. Eli stood by the corral, swinging, an heavy iron bar with grim determination, shattering the thick layer of ice in the trough so the horses could drink. The sharp sound echoed across the empty plains like a gunshot. He didn't look up when she walked up behind him. "What do you want? Me to do?" she asked, her voice snatched away by the wind. He leaned the bar against the fence and finally lifted his gaze to hers. His expression was unreadable, hard as the landscape around him, but the corners of his eyes seemed to soften, just a fraction. "There's coffee on the stove," he said. "Drink some. Then I need 2 buckets carried up from the creek to the house. Fill the wood box. Check the chickens for eggs." He gestured toward the distant ridge, where the gray sky met the snow. Wind knocked down. "Some fence rails on the north line. I'll be riding out. Should be back by midday." He swung himself into the saddle. It was a stiff, practiced motion, and she saw him wince as his bad leg took the weight, but he didn't make a sound. Before he turned the horse, he glanced at her one last time. "Don't let the fire die," he ordered Dot. Then he spurred the horse and was gone, swallowed up by the cold, gray horizon. Mara stood alone in the howling wind. She felt small, almost invisible against the vastness of the plains. But underneath the fear, there was something else. A spark, purpose Eli had given her. A role. He had given her a way to stay without shame. She went inside, downed the scalding coffee to chase away the chill, and stepped back out into the cold. The creek was 100 yards behind the cabin. The buckets were heavy iron, and each trip strained her arms until they trembled uncontrollably. At one point, her boots slipped on the icy bank, sending her crashing down to one knee and soaking her trousers. But she didn't stop. She gritted her teeth and stood back up. She filled the wood box until it overflowed. She scattered scratch grain for the chickens and searched the nests, finding 3 eggs cold against her palm, but unbroken. Asterisk. By the time Eli returned, the cabin was swept clean, warm, and smelled of frying pork. He stomped the snow from his boots at the threshold and stepped inside. He paused, looking around the tidy room, and then his eyes landed on her. "You got a lot done," he said. It wasn't praise, exactly, just a statement of fact, but to Mara, it meant the world. She nodded, her hands twisting the wooden spoon she was holding. He sat and ate quickly, silently, yet there was no malice in his quiet. They spoke only a handful of words, but something in the small room had shifted. A thin, fragile thread of trust had begun to spin itself between them. It wasn't strong yet, and it certainly wasn't certain, but it was there. The days began to blend into a rhythm. Mara hauled water, chopped kindling, and swept the floors. Eli tended the cattle, rode the fence lines, and repaired gear by the firelight. They shared meals at the small table, trading short, simple sentences. She watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. She saw how he moved calm, steady, carrying a quiet sadness that seemed to weigh down his shoulders. And he watched her. Too, she would catch him glancing at her hands, at the yellow bruises fading on her wrists, or noting the way she flinched at sudden noises. One night, about a week into her stay, she was drying dishes when a plate slipped from her soapy fingers. It shattered across the floorboards. The sound was sharp and violent in the quiet cabin. Mara froze instantly. Her shoulders went tight, her breath locked in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the shout, waiting for the anger, waiting for the blow. Instead, she heard the scrape of a chair. Eli stood up and walked to the corner. He picked up the broom and held it out to her. Handle first. Handle first, he said quietly, so you don't cut yourself. Mara stared at him, bewildered. You're not angry? It's a plate, he said simply. I've broken worse. He went back to mending a bridle, never raising his voice, never even looking annoyed. It confused her. It scared her a little. Kindness always did. It was harder to predict than cruelty. Over the next few days, the tension in the cabin softened. She began to speak a little more. Just small things at first. She told him how the wind in Missouri sounded different, like a whistle instead of a roar. She told him she liked the smell of sagebrush after the rain. She admitted, voice barely a whisper, that she had once dreamed of learning to read properly. Eli listened. He didn't offer pity, and he didn't show impatience. He just gave her his quiet attention. Sometimes he shared things too. His voice was always steady, but a shadow would pass behind his eyes when he talked about the war, or about the girl he had once planned to marry, the one the fever took while he was away fighting. Pain. Recognized pain. Something gentle began to grow in the empty space between them. One morning, Eli brought her boots inside from the porch. She hadn't even noticed he'd taken them. I fixed the soles, he said, setting them down near the stove. Snow's getting worse. Thin leather will get you killed out here. Mara picked them up. Fresh, thick leather patches had been nailed neatly to the bottoms, and the uppers had been oiled to keep out the wet. Thank you, she said softly. He shrugged, avoiding her eyes, turning to grab his coat. Just keeping my help on her feet. But as he turned away, she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. It was almost a smile. As the weeks dragged on, winter tightened its grip on the Wyoming plains. The snow piled high against the cabin walls, burying the world outside in a suffocating white silence. But inside, the cast-iron stove burned day and night, creating a small island of heat in the frozen sea. Mara and Eli fell into a routine that was dangerous in its comfort. It was a steady, quiet closeness that felt natural, yet frightening. Sometimes, when she spoke, she would catch Eli looking at her, his eyes softening in a way that made her chest feel tight, like she couldn't quite catch her breath. And sometimes, when they brushed past each other in the narrow space between the table and the stove, her heart would jump before she could tell it to stop, but nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said, until the day Eli announced they had to ride into 2 creeks for supplies. Mara's stomach dropped. The mere mention of the town made her blood run cold. Going back to civilization meant facing eyes, whispers, and the kind of judgments she knew all too well. Do I have to go? She asked, her voice barely audible. Eli was already tightening the cinch on the saddle. He didn't look up, but his tone was final. I need help loading the wagon, he said, and you need a proper coat. You can't survive out here in flannel. He said it like a fact, not a favor. They rode into town under a sky the color of slate, the wind whipping dust and grit down the main street. As their wagon rattled past the saloon, the men lounging outside went silent. Women standing on their porches stopped sweeping to stare openly, whispering behind gloved hands. Shame flushed hot across Mara's cheeks. She kept her head down, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear inside the collar of Eli's spare jacket. They entered the general store, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully, a stark contrast to the tension in the air. Two women near the counter turned to look. They nodded politely at Eli, but then their eyes slid to Mara. There. Expressions curdled instantly. "Well," one of them said, her voice pitched loud enough to carry to the back of the room. "It seems Mr. Turner has brought company." The other woman snickered, a sharp, ugly sound. "I suppose it gets lonely out on the range. A rancher takes what he can get, doesn't he?" Mara felt her heart collapse inward. She wanted to sink through the floorboards. She wanted to run. She tried to shrink away, to hide behind a stack of grain sacks. Eli froze. He was holding a sack of flour, his knuckles white against the fabric. Slowly, deliberately, he set it down. The sound was heavy in the sudden silence. He turned. He didn't shout, and he didn't storm over. He just walked toward them with a slow, dangerous calm that was far more terrifying than any yell. The women shrank back, their smiles vanishing. "This lady," Eli said, his voice low and steady, vibrating with a quiet menace, "is my hired help. She is a guest in my home. You will speak about her with respect, or you will not speak at all." The room went dead silent. The women paled, clutching, their shawls tight. Eli held their gaze for a second longer, daring them to say another word. When they looked away, he turned his back on them completely. He looked at Mara, his expression softening instantly. "Go pick out a wool coat," he said, gently. "And gloves." Mara's eyes burned with sudden tears. No one had ever defended her like that. Not with anger, not with violence, but with simple, unshakable dignity. When they stepped back outside into the biting wind, Mara felt her hands trembling. "You didn't have to lie for me," she whispered, staring at the ground. "I'm not respectable. Eli, you know that." Eli finished loading the supplies into the wagon and turned to face her. He looked her dead in the eye, his expression firm. "I didn't lie," he said. "You're worth more than what those people think. You're worth more than you think." Mara looked away, unable to hold his gaze, but her chest warmed in a way that was both terrifying and beautiful. She did not know it yet, but danger was already riding toward them, and the past she had tried so hard to outrun was about to find her. The morning everything changed. The Wyoming sky was a deceptive, brilliant blue. It looked peaceful, almost gentle, but the air carried a strange, electric tension that Mara could feel vibrating in her bones. It was the calm before the storm, though she couldn't yet name the danger. Eli had spent the early hours in the barn, repairing tack, while Mara hauled water from the creek. They worked quietly, side by side in their separate tasks, each lost in thoughts of the coming weeks. Judge Holloway would be passing through Two Creeks soon on his circuit, and they needed to be ready. But what neither of them knew was that danger wouldn't wait for a judge. It was already riding up the lane. That afternoon, Mara was scattering grain for the chickens when the sound of approaching hooves drifted on the wind. She straightened up, shielding her eyes against the glare of the sun. A single rider was coming down the road. He sat with a straight, rigid posture, wearing a fine city coat and a flat-brimmed hat that didn't belong on the range. Mara's breath froze in her chest. The bucket dropped from her hand, spilling grain into the dirt. She knew that silhouette dotted was Jonas, the man she had escaped, the man who had owned every corner of her fear for years, the man she had prayed would never find her in this forgotten corner of the plains. He reined in his horse a few yards away and smiled, a slow, cold expression that made her stomach twist into knots. "Well," Jonas drawled, swinging down from his saddled with an easy grace. "You've done well for yourself, haven't you, Mara?" Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. "Go away." He stepped closer, the scent of bay rum and stale cigar smoke washing over her, suffocating and familiar. "I heard the stories," he said smoothly. "A lonely rancher takes in a broken little stray. I thought I'd come collect what's mine." His hand shot out, snake-quick, grabbing her arm. His fingers dug into the tender flesh above her elbow. Old, familiar grip meant to bruise without breaking bone. "You owe me," he hissed, his charming mask slipping. "Room and board. Lost earnings. You don't just walk away in the middle of the night, Mara. You pay the price." "I don't have anything," she whispered, shaking. "Then you'll work it off," he sneered. "You belong to me until the debt is settled." Mara tried to pull free, panic rising in her throat, but Jonas tightened his hold, jerking her closer. "You'll pack your things," he said, leaning in until his face was inches from hers. "You come back with me. And don't think about screaming for your cowboy. I've got men watching from that ridge. They'd love an excuse to put a bullet in him." Mara's heart cracked with terror. She could not let Eli die for her. Not him. Not the only person who had ever shown her kindness. "I'll come," she choked out. "Just don't hurt him." Jonas dropped her arm and tipped his hat, smug satisfaction plastered across his face. "Meet me in town by sundown. Don't make me come back here, Mara. It'll get messy." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving her shaking, blood pounding in her ears like a war drum. She ran inside the cabin, throwing her few belongings onto the table, her hands trembling so badly she could barely tie the bundle. She had to leave. She had to get out before Eli saw her, before he got involved, before Jonas killed him. But before she could reach the door, the sound of galloping hooves thundered outside, far too fast to be Jonas returning. The door burst open. Eli stood there, chest heaving, his eyes wild. "Pifed a man in a black coat on the road," he said, breathless. "Who was he?" Mara froze. Eli looked at the bundle on the table. Then his eyes snapped to her face, seeing the fresh red marks blooming on her arm where Jonas had grabbed her. His face went still, dangerously still. "Mara," he said quietly, his voice dropping an octave. "Who touched you?" She couldn't hold it back any longer. The dam broke. "It was Jonas," she cried, the words ripping out of her throat. "He found me, Eli. He says I owe him. He says I belong to him. He has men. He said he'll kill you if I don't go back." Eli stepped closer, ignoring her panic. He gripped her wrists, not to hurt, but to anchor her. "You think I'm letting you walk out that door alone?" he asked, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "You think I'm letting that man take you back to the hell you ran from? I'm not worth you getting killed for." She sobbed, trying to pull away. "I'm nothing but—" "No," he snapped. He cupped her face in his rough hands, forcing her to look at him. "You are not nothing. You are not what he made you believe. You are stronger than you think, and you are worth more than any life I've lived up to now." Tears blurred Mara's vision, spilling over onto his hands. "You mean everything to me," he said softly, and for the first time in her life, looking into his dark, fierce eyes. Mara believed someone actually meant it. They rode into two creeks side by side, the rhythmic thud of hooves on packed dirt, the only sound in the heavy afternoon air. As they passed the livery and the general store, the town seemed to fall unnaturally silent. Conversations died on porches. Heads turned to watch them pass. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for the violence that hung in the air like static. They dismounted in front of the saloon. Eli tied off the horses, his movements calm and deliberate, though Mara could see the tension in the set of his jaw. He gave her a single nod, a silent promise, and pushed the batwing doors open. The saloon was dim and smelled of stale beer and sawdust. At their entrance, the low hum of conversation cut off instantly. At the back of the room, leaning against the bar with a glass of brandy in his hand, stood Jonas. He smiled when he saw them, a smug, satisfied curling of his lips that made Mara's blood run cold. "So," Jonas announced, his voice carrying easily through the quiet room, "my runaway finally comes crawling back." Eli stepped forward, positioning himself squarely between Jonas and Mara, blocking the man's view of her. His hand rested near, his hip not on his gun, but close enough to send a message. "We're here for the judge," Eli said, his voice ringing out strong and steady against the wooden walls. "You don't take her anywhere." Jonas chuckled darkly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, waving it like a victory flag. "I don't need force, Cowboy. I have the law." He slapped the paper onto the bar. "Signed by her own hand. It states clearly that she owes me a debt for room, board, and damages. She belongs to me until that debt is paid in full." Marshal Cobb, a gray-bearded man who had been watching from a corner table, stood up slowly. He walked over, the spurs on his boots jingling, and picked up the paper. He squinted at it in the dim light, scratching his chin. "That signature looks shaky," Cobb grunted, looking from the paper to Jonas. "Could be real, could be forced." Jonas leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Ask her." She admitted she signed it. All eyes in the room turned to Mara. The weight of their gazes felt physical, crushing her. Her hands began to tremble violently. Shame clawed its way up her throat, choking her. For a terrifying moment, she felt herself slipping back into this old fear, the old silence, the belief that she was nothing. Then she felt it. Eli's hand found the small of her back. It was a warm, heavy weight steadying her, anchoring her to the ground. He didn't push her forward. He just let her know he was there. Mara took a breath. She stepped out from behind Eli. "He is lying," she said. Her voice trembled at first, but she forced it louder, making sure every man in the room could hear. "He beat me. He trapped me in that house. He made me sign whatever he wanted, because if I didn't, I wouldn't eat." She pointed a shaking finger at the paper. "That contract is not a debt, Marshal. It's a chain." A murmur rippled through the room. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jonas's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine fury. "Marshal." Cobb looked at Mara, then at Jonas. He slowly folded the paper and tossed it back onto the bar. He crossed his arms over his chest. "I'm not dragging a woman off on a maybe," Cobb said flatly. "Judge Holloway is due on his circuit in 3 weeks. He'll look at the paper. He'll hear the testimony. Until then, she stays where she is." Jonas's face twisted. "You will regret this, Marshal. That girl is property." "That girl," Cobb interrupted, his voice hardening, "is a citizen until a judge says otherwise. Now get out of my face." Eli didn't wait. He took Mara's arm and guided her toward the door. As they stepped out into the street, Jonas shouted after them, his voice raw with anger. "You have 3 weeks, Turner. When the judge sees that contract, she comes back to me, and you'll lose everything." They mounted their horses without looking back, but the threat hung over them like a thunderhead. The victory in the saloon felt thin, fragile. As they turned their horses toward the open plains, the sky finally broke open. Rain began to pelt the earth, cold and hard, and lightning cracked across the horizon. Mara was shaking, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline crashing out of her system. What if the judge believes him? She cried over the sound of the rising wind. "What if I can't outrun my past, Eli? Eli reached across the gap between their horses and grabbed her shoulder. His grip was firm, refusing to let her spiral into panic. "You aren't running anymore," he shouted over the storm. "You stand and fight, and you don't do it alone." The storm broke over them with the violence of a whip crack. The sky turned a bruised purple, and rain lashed against the earth, turning the dust of the road into slick, treacherous mud. Lightning forked across the horizon, illuminating the vast emptiness of the plains in stark, flashing white. They rode hard, heads ducked against the gale. The wind tore at their clothes and stung their faces, but neither of them slowed down. For Mara, the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm raging in her mind. Jonas's threats, the piece of paper that claimed to own her, the look in the marshal's eyes, it all swirled together in a terrifying vortex. By the time the dark shape of the cabin emerged from the driving rain, they were both soaked to the bone and shivering. They stabled the horses quickly, Eli's hands moving with efficient speed despite the cold. He ushered her toward the house, his body shielding her from the worst of the wind until they stumbled through the door. The silence of the cabin wrapped around them instantly. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, but the room still held a faint, lingering warmth. Mara stood in the center of the floor, water dripping from the hem of her coat, pooling around her boots. The adrenaline that had sustained her in town suddenly evaporated, leaving her hollow and shaking. Her knees gave way, and she sank onto the bench by the table, burying her face in her hands. What if the judge believes him? She cried, her voice muffled by her palms. The sound was small and broken in the quiet room. "He has the paper, Eli. He has the law. What if I can't outrun my past?" Eli didn't answer immediately. He hung his hat on the peg and walked over to her. He didn't sit across from her this time. He stood right beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He reached out and took her by the shoulders. His grip was gentle, but firm, unyielding iron wrapped in velvet. "Look at me," he said. Mara slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed, wide with panic. "You aren't running anymore," Eli said. He spoke the words slowly, giving each one weight. "You stand and fight, and you don't do it alone." He leaned down, resting his forehead against hers. They stood there for a long minute, damp breath mingling, the world outside reduced to nothing but the sound of rain on the roof and the beating of their own hearts. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not letting go." Mara closed her eyes, letting the sensation wash over her. She absorbed the warmth of his words, letting them seep into the cold, cracked places of her soul. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being held. She wasn't used to being believed in. And she certainly wasn't used to being chosen. For her whole life, she had been something to be used, something to be discarded, something to be chased. But here, in this rugged cabin at the edge of the world, she was something else. "You're worth fighting for," Eli whispered. The words hit her like a physical blow, shattering the last of her defenses. Her heart broke open, not with pain, but with a sudden, soft trembling. It was the feeling of walls coming down. She reached up, her hand finding his arm, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in the universe. For the first time, the shadow of Jonas, the shame of Silver Creek, and the fear of the contract felt distant. They were still there, looming like the mountains in the west, but they no longer covered the whole sky. For once, her past felt smaller than her future. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and they both knew the battle was far from over. Jonas would return. The judge would come. The world would try to tear them apart. But as the firelight began to flicker back to life in the grate, casting long shadows against the log walls, Mara knew she wouldn't be facing it alone. Danger was only sleeping, but for tonight, hope was awake.